On the 24th of June 1995, the nation's rugby team, the Springboks, overcame the powerful All Blacks of New Zealand to win the third ever Rugby World Cup, the nation's first in what was their team's first ever appearance at the tournament. The country exploded in celebration, celebrating the landmark success in South Africa's most popular sport. More than a simple sporting victory, the tournament, also held in South Africa, represented the symbolic rebirth of the country as one with equal rights for its inhabitants. The notorious apartheid system had been abolished only a year earlier, and the Springboks had been excluded from the previous Rugby World Cups on account of the discriminatory policy which had been in place since 1948. The jubilation which accompanied the victory came alongside hopes for an equitable future for the country and banishment of the bitter past. The tournament and the period was documented in the 2008 book Playing the Enemy by author John Carlin, which was in turn converted into a 2009 film called Invictus, directed by Clint Eastwood. South Africa's president, Nelson Mandela, had targeted success in the World Cup as a symbolic way to heal the wounds and division caused by decades of separation. And in June 1995, it seemed that this had paid off. But while the brutal system had been overhauled almost miraculously without a major outbreak of violence, this did and does not mean that economic and political equality has come to South Africa. So let's explore, shall we? One thing that probably most know about South Africa, and which is important in the context of today's video, is that the country is incredibly diverse. South Africa has no fewer than 11 official languages, ranging from those of the Bantu family, such as Xhosa, Zulu, and Venda, to Indo-European languages such as English and the Dutch-derived Afrikaans. A further 11 languages have recognition or support of some kind, and more still are spoken by smaller communities among the vast 60 million person population. In terms of ethnicity, South Africa is very unique. It has a large population of Asian or Indian South Africans, white South Africans, and so-called coloreds, in addition to the black African majority and large immigrant populations from other countries. These groups can be broken down further still, with black South Africans alone divisible into dozens of different tribes and ethnic groups, most with their own language and customs. These ethnicities can be separated into 4 overall subgroups: the Nguni, the Xhosa and Zulu people, the Shangana Tonga, the Sotho Tswana, and the Venda, all including a range of different languages, traditions, beliefs, and customs. Just before we continue, quick shout out to our fantastic sponsor today, and that is GamerSupps. What are GamerSupps? Well, they make fantastic energy drinks. Big fan of energy drinks. I love caffeine. There's no doubt about it. I drink too much coffee. Now, less coffee, more hydration thanks to GamerSupps. You take a scoop of this, you put it in the bottle, you shake it up, and you're good to go. It is super affordable because you just buy it in the powdered form. There's no shipping a liquid everywhere. I used to buy ridiculously overpriced drinks from the little corner shop next to my office, and now I don't go in there anymore because I have GamerSupps, which is just better in every way. It's also more delicious. It's caffeinated. If you just feel like getting some extra hydration, you can get the caffeine-free versions. This is just melon. It's great. Sometimes what I do is I'll just mix it up, like half a spoon of caffeinated, half a scoop of non-caffeinated. There's a lemon flavor that I mix, a lemon caffeinated flavor that I mix with the just melon flavor. And it's just fantastic stuff. It's really good. It's delicious. It keeps me going. It keeps me hydrated, and it can do the same for you. So just go to gamersupps.gg/places and get hooked up with some GamerSupps there. I think there's a 10% discount code as well if you use the code PLACES, which is fantastic, isn't it? And now back to today's episode. Some South African ethnic groups actually have a degree of cultural or administrative autonomy. The Zulu have their own king, and others have customary laws. There even exists a National House of Traditional Leaders, a body of 23 members, which advises the president of South Africa on their customary laws. Even the European origin South Africans are relatively diverse, separated into the minority Anglo-Africans who are of British origin and natively English-speaking, and the mostly Dutch and French Huguenot-descended Afrikaners who constitute the majority of white South Africans and speak the Afrikaans language natively. There are also white South Africans who belong to neither group, many of them descended from immigrants who arrived during the Apartheid era, and some of whom played a role in the most significant political developments of the period. Noteworthy examples include Greek Mozambican Dimitris Safendas, who assassinated Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, in the South African Parliament in 1966, as well as Janusz Wolosz, a Polish-born man who assassinated civil rights activist Chris Hani in 1993. Given its vast array of languages, ethnicities, races, religions, cultures, and traditions, it is hardly a mystery why South Africa was dubbed the Rainbow Nation by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Desmond Tutu in 1994. But it is also the many racial or ethnic classifications of the Rainbow Nation which were the basis for the political and economic manipulation of apartheid in terms of discrimination and privilege alike. For example, Asian South Africans suffered discriminatory measures, but less severely than the coloreds. White people were at the top of the system, though Afrikaners marginally more so than Anglo-Africans. Black South Africans, often collectively referred to as Bantu peoples, were dead last and suffered by far the most discrimination, sometimes even at the hands of other discriminated racial groups. In fact, the inhuman racial classifications of apartheid led to a general sectarianism and deterioration of relations between many of the categorized groups. In 1949, huge unrest broke out between the Black South African and Asian South African communities of the city of Durban. The so-called Durban riots lasted 3 days, left 142 people dead, and remain one of the worst episodes of violence in South African history. In many ways, it is the legacy of apartheid which underlies the inequality present in South Africa today, as we shall see later in this video. Although discriminatory practices, in theory, no longer officially exist, the economic status of South Africa's population remains skewed along ethnic lines. This imbalance is so great that it has resulted in South Africa remaining the most unequal country in the world, according to several independent metrics. In 2024, Swiss bank UBS released their annual Global Wealth Report, highlighting where wealth inequalities have grown the furthest. South Africa uncontestedly topped the list, scoring 82 out of 100 on the Inequality Index. In doing so, it edged out Brazil at 81, as well as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, both at 77. Another common metric used to judge income inequality is the famous Gini coefficient, introduced by Italian statistician Corrado Gini in 1912. The Gini score ranges from 0, or lowest inequality, to 1, highest inequality. If one person earned all of the income in a nation and the rest earned exactly nothing, the Gini coefficient score would be 1. Well, South Africa has a Gini score of 0.65, the highest in the world, with the second highest ranking found to be Namibia at 0.59, a state which was administratively part of South Africa until 1990. So, how did this come to be, and what, if anything, is being done about it? Although this notorious political system is well known, what is perhaps not as well known is the rigid structure it put in place alongside other features which contributed to the massive inequality which exists to this day. In fact, although apartheid was introduced in the mid-20th century, restrictions on Black South Africans' freedoms long preceded it. In 1905, while South Africa was still controlled by the United Kingdom, a piece of legislation known as the General Pass Regulations Act denied Black Africans the right to vote and limited them to living in fixed regions. After South Africa became a dominion in 1910, the Native Land Act was passed, which further prevented black people in most of South Africa from buying land outside certain reserves. Next, the Urban Areas Act of 1923 introduced segregation in mixed areas. Further legislation then resulted in restrictions on the freedoms of other South African minorities, mostly Asian South Africans and so-called coloreds, an Afrikaans-speaking ethnic group mostly residing in the Cape region of Western South Africa. Apartheid was introduced after the Second World War by the right-wing nationalist party of Hendrik Verwoerd. It remains in place for more than 40 years. Apartheid was based on a political philosophy known as Baaskap, which advocated for the domination of the state by the white minority, especially Afrikaners, and a strict control over the presence of the black majority in the labor force. Its first law was to prohibit the intermarriage of whites and non-whites, followed by a ban on all sexual relations between them. In 1950, the infamous Population Registration Act was passed, which classified people into one of 4 races: white, Indian, colored, and black. The classification would be carried out according to a set of measures, which included ancestry and physical features. But it also included very arbitrary elements like socioeconomic status, knowledge of the Afrikaans language, and even drinking habits. Keeping in mind that the Indian South African population included a significant merchant class and the coloreds were at least predominantly Afrikaans speaking, this left the black South Africans to bear the unmitigated brunt of the oppressive classification. As a matter of fact, despite the many diverse ethnicities and tribes mentioned previously, they were the only one of the 4 groups not to be subcategorized further under the Act. So while the Indian and coloured South Africans were broken down into Cape Coloureds, Cape Malays, Indians, Chinese, and so on, the vast black population shared one simple designation: black. Over time, apartheid sanctioned severe segregation and discrimination against South Africa's non-white majority population, which resulted in the widespread forced resettlement of millions of black South Africans. By the time apartheid was repealed in the 1990s, black populations had lived for generations in various overcrowded districts, many of which had become ghettos. The social and economic repercussions of the discriminatory policy persisted, therefore, long beyond its abolishment. A noteworthy example is the massive settlement of Soweto. Shorthand for Southwest Townships and located adjacent to the city of Johannesburg, Soweto was established in the 1930s as the separation of racial communities got underway. Over time, people poured into the settlement, which quickly became densely populated and rife with poverty. Today, some million people live there, making it the largest township in the country. Its population is predominantly black South Africans, and it was here that many of the anti-apartheid movements took hold. Nelson Mandela resided in Soweto for many years, as did current President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was born there. The township became a hub of political activism, and in 1976, it saw one of the most traumatic losses of life in the apartheid era. It had recently been announced that local schools would be forced to teach in English and Afrikaans, the latter of which led to particular outrage. While many black South Africans saw utility in English, Afrikaans was considered as the language of their oppressor and was spoken by almost nobody natively in Soweto. Moreover, non-Afrikaans-speaking white populations would not be subject to the measure. The outrage quickly turned into the Soweto uprising, which was viciously put down by authorities. It is thought that up to 700 people may have been killed. The apartheid era also saw South Africa establish so-called Bantustans for black Africans. These were de facto separate states, usually in arid and undeveloped regions into which black Africans were herded, losing their South African citizenship in the process. Between 1960 and 1980, some 3.5 million black South Africans were deported to resettlement camps in Bantustans, which were recognized by nobody but South Africa and were roundly criticized by the international community. Nevertheless, at one time, there were 20 of them in South Africa and modern-day Namibia, and their existence led to a concentration of black populations in certain regions which continued beyond the fall of the system. After 1994, the Bantustans were reabsorbed into South Africa, and a reconfiguration of its provinces took place. What this meant was that practically the remainder of South African land was free to purchase by the privileged few, leading to not only oversaturated and impoverished urban areas, but the lopsided land distribution that continues today. Eventually, years of domestic and international pressure led to the fall of apartheid. South Africa had increasingly become a sort of pariah in the international sphere, being boycotted by multiple countries and excluded from sporting tournaments by the 1970s and 80s. At home, the situation was not much better as civil rights movements and left-wing organizations rallied for an end to the system. Even before the horrific Soweto uprising, another anti-apartheid protest in the township of Sharpeville had been brutally put down by state police, resulting in 91 deaths. Many of the dead were shot as they fled, and the total number of victims was hidden by the state for many years. The Sharpeville massacre led to the rise of what became known as the Black Consciousness Movement, or BCM. The movement advocated greater solidarity amongst black South Africans, colored, and Indians. It rejected apartheid and also rejected what it saw as the patronizing attitudes of white liberals and anti-apartheid activists towards black culture. The BCM was suppressed heavily by the state, and its leader, Stephen Bantu Biko, was arrested and beaten to death in a police station in 1977. The rise of the movement coincided with some more aggressive opposition groups to apartheid, most famously Unequal, a paramilitary organization which became the armed wing of the African National Congress. The ANC was the most major African nationalist political party established all the way back in 1912, but it had been banned after Sharpeville and remained underground throughout apartheid. One of the most noteworthy figures of Umkhonto we Sizwe was its founder, Nelson Mandela, who was convicted of terrorism in 1964 and spent 27 years there, having narrowly escaped the death penalty. During his lengthy imprisonment, Mandela abandoned violent means to overcome the regime and became the leading voice for a peaceful transfer of power. He was released in 1990 and soon became the leader of the ANC and later one of the most celebrated statesmen in history. His release coincided with the weakening of the system, and the ground was eventually set for its downfall. Eventually, a referendum on the abolishment of apartheid was called in 1992, only open to white voters. The referendum passed with 68% in favor, which led to the fall of the system in 1994. Mandela was elected president of South Africa the same year. With that said, The end of the repressive system brought a period of significant instability to South Africa. Between 1990 and the repeal of the system in 1994, 14,000 people died in political killings. Only 7,000 people had died in known political killings in the Apartheid era, so this represented a significant surge, although it later emerged that many state-sanctioned killings had been covered up or denied by apartheid governments. Still, as the system waned, fears of a race war rose. A standoff took place in Pretoria in 1993 when a conservative organization known as the Afrikaner Volksfront amassed and threatened to ignite a conflict, but were ultimately stood down by their leader, Constant Verloen. Another dissident left-wing group, the ultranationalist AWB, along with some members of the Volksfront, staged another standoff in 1994 in the Bantustan of Bophuthatswana. Eventually, this too subsided after a short conflict which claimed the lives of 4 AWB members and 67 civilians. Generally, although instances of violence, retribution, and terrorism took place, the race war that many feared and some hoped for did not take place. 14,000 lives were lost, but a brittle peace was secured, which allowed for the phasing out of the system and the beginning of a new era in South Africa. Mandela brought into place the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1996, which exposed but generally pardoned crimes committed during the period. While hardly ideal, since it allowed many participants in the brutal system to escape without punishment, it did at least allow some closure to affected families and helped avoid a violent reaction from the minority population as power was transferred away from them. By the mid-90s, free elections had taken place, and as expected, the ANC stormed to power, assuming 252 of an available 400 seats in the National Assembly. The ANC have remained in power ever since as the preferred party of the majority population. But with that said, their rule has not been without criticism, controversy, corruption, and internal divisions. Now, before moving on, it is important to understand the oftentimes precarious political landscape in South Africa, which has been seen by some as upholding or at least permitting the great inequality which has persisted since apartheid. The ANC, following its legalization in 1990 to its rise to power in 1994, has dominated South African politics in the period since. For 6 years in the 90s, it was led by Mandela and was later led by his deputy, Thabo Mbeki, and then Jacob Zuma, and finally the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. During its successful 1994 campaign, the ANC ran on the slogan of "A better life for all" and promised expanded access to housing, healthcare, education, and the economy. However, the ANC's record on actually delivering on these promises in the 30 years since has been dismissed by some observers as dismal. It has largely failed to address impoverishment, the land and property ownership imbalance, and skyrocketing crime. The ANC has also been subject to many claims of corruption and profiteering, and Jacob Zuma, its leader for 10 years, was in 2021 convicted for benefiting from a controversial arms deal while president of South Africa. Another former president, Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki, has been accused of profiting from that same deal. Resultantly, trust in the ANC has plummeted, something reflected at the ballot box. Although it remains South Africa's single largest party, the ANC now holds just 159 seats in the National Assembly from a high of 252 in 1994. It remains in government, but only in coalition with the second-place Democratic Alliance and other parties, a coalition which collectively holds 71% of seats in what has become a highly fractured legislative chamber. In 2024, South Africa remains troubled by its massive inequality amid a string of other pressing issues. Perhaps surprisingly, the wealth disparity has only been increasing since apartheid fell, although the imbalance can, no doubt, be traced to the oppressive system which dominated the country for so long. With that said, it's not that no progress has been made. The black middle class has grown significantly, being now numerically greater in size than the white middle class. Basic human rights are guaranteed to all citizens, access to education has improved, and South Africa's GDP per capita remains relatively high. At $5,700, it ranks among the highest in Africa and nearly 3 times that of Nigeria or Kenya. Moreover, the share of farmland owned by black South Africans, according to the government, has risen to 25%, the highest in history. But for the many, including South Africa's poorest, the situation remains dire. According to the IMF, in 2017, the wealthiest 20% of South Africa's population held around 70% of the country's income. Further, the wealth of South Africa was found to be overwhelmingly concentrated in the major urban hubs, with the inhabitants of the province of Gauteng, home to the country's administrative capital, Pretoria, and most prosperous city, Johannesburg, being almost twice as wealthy, on average, as the inhabitants of the rural region of Limpopo and the Eastern Cape. Furthermore, according to CNN, South Africa's wealthiest 10% held about 71% of the nation's wealth in total in 2018, and the bottom 60% held just 7%. South Africa's richest households were about 10 times as wealthy as poor households. Central to the question of economic inequality is land ownership, which remains predominantly in the hands of the white minority. A government audit in 2018 revealed that 72% of South Africa's farmland was owned by the white minority, which at that time constituted less than a tenth of the population, although, as mentioned before, and if government figures are to be believed, this share has since fallen. The black majority remains by far the most economically deprived and constitutes the majority of South Africa's high unemployment rate, which is 32%, according to government figures. A black South African was found to be 4 times as likely to be unemployed as a white South African. It was also found that about half of South Africa's population lived below the poverty threshold in 2018, judged at around $83 of income per month. Around 64% of the people falling into this category were found to be black South Africans, around 41% coloreds, and 6% Indian or Asian South Africans, and just 1% white. In terms of income, the same CNN report determined, using the economic classification on which apartheid relied, that the average white South African earned the equivalent of about $844 per month, and Asian South Africans earned around $823. Coloreds earned on average $334, and black South Africans only around 305. The great wealth disparity in South Africa is, in some places, visible to the naked eye, with lavish suburban neighborhoods in provinces like Gauteng and the Western Cape existing directly adjacent to poor, overcrowded slums and temporary housing. Swimming pools sit beside shanty towns. Paved roads run parallel to dirt tracks. And amidst the vast economic imbalance, demands for reparations and redistribution of wealth have remained a hotly contested topic. Some have proposed the abolishment of inheritance, effectively meaning that the property of a deceased person would either have to be bought at full price by the inheritor or would be placed on the market. Others have proposed a higher inheritance tax, resulting in at least some bequeathed properties being made available to a new buyer. In South Africa, inheritance tax, referred to as estate duty, is applied to estates above a certain value threshold. Currently, the state charges a 20% tax on estates worth between 3.5 and 30 million rands, about 190 to 1.7 million US dollars, and 25% on any estate valued above that. However, to remove inheritance or to increase the estate duty would almost certainly affect all economic groups, including the growing black middle class. And to instead implement a measure specifically targeting certain racial groups would come with its own problems and several lawsuits. But there are those who've proposed a more radical solution still, one which comes with even more pronounced risks. This is the idea of a simple expropriation of assets or land without compensation, something supported by several activist groups. Perhaps the most aggressive exponent of this rapid solution to the issue in post-apartheid South Africa is a party which emerged in the 2010s, known as the Economic Freedom Fighters. The Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF, were established in 2013 in Soweto by dissidents who'd broken away from the ANC. At the center was the party's founder and leader, Julius Malema Selo. Malema has been accused of running the EFF with an iron fist, purging uncooperative members and critics. He has also been accused of money laundering, threats to journalists, and has twice been convicted of hate speech. Many elements of the EFF styling are peculiar, if not downright amusing. The group and its officials wear red overalls, including in Parliament, including berets, which parody revolutionary organizations from around the world in the 20th century. Their rallies often resemble concerts or sports events, or perhaps some kind of mega-church service, with thousands of red-clad supporters dancing in tandem to African music and chants. However, its positions are far from amusing. A central theme in its program is the swift redistribution of South African land assets, something visible in its rather uncreative party slogan, "Our land and jobs now." The EFF released a memorandum on its plan for land expropriation without compensation in 2020 and has bitterly argued in favor of the divisive plan, which gained momentum following the government's 2018 land ownership audit. Following some support from the ANC, the question gained enough traction, such as to gain the attention of then US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in 2020, who declared it would be disastrous for South Africa and its economy. Now, with the EFF, it is difficult to separate political bluster from genuine ideological positions. Its rhetoric is often bellicose and violent, and it has been accused of several instances of race-based incitement, particularly against white and Asian South Africans. The party has nevertheless seen success at the ballot box, becoming the fourth largest party party in South Africa. It has a membership of more than 1 million and occupies around 10% of the seats in the National Assembly, the directly elected house of the South African Parliament. Just like its leader, the EFF has faced other controversies, having been accused of corruption, media intimidation, tampering with the judiciary, pseudo-militaristic posturing, and repeated instances of racism. Amidst allegations of anti-white and anti-Indian racism, Malema has come in for particular scrutiny. He received notoriety for his retweeting of ominous statements by Robert Mugabe, which included the quote, "The only white man you can trust is a dead white man." He has also led a number of controversial chants at his energetic EFF rallies, most notably the chant, "Kill the farmer." Now, some have defended the use of the song, arguing it is a traditional rallying cry and it's not to be a literal call to violence against farmers. However, given the high rate of farm attacks in South Africa, the current use of the chant has been labelled by many as yet another example of hate speech. Malema has virulently insisted he will continue to use the song at his rallies in spite of the backlash. Amidst the militant rhetoric of groups such as the EFF and factions of the ANC, the land-owning classes of South Africa have looked on with some nervousness. And their fears are not entirely unfounded. As the discourse regarding land ownership and redistribution of South Africa's assets has raged on, multiple high-profile killings and farm attacks have taken place, which have thrown fuel to the fire of expropriation without compensation, but by violent means. One of the most notable cases was the 2010 killing of Eugene Terreblanche, founder and leader of the ultranationalist AWB, who was hacked to death by labourers at his farm in the townland of Ventersdorp. And it's not exactly that wealthy South Africans have to look far to see an example of chaotic land grabs put into practice. Such was the case in neighbouring Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, when the ZANU-PF party under Robert Mugabe permitted the reclamation of white-owned farms by black Africans, resulting in a string of violent acts and the flight of many white Zimbabweans to Britain, Australia, and South Africa. For many, it would appear that the insidious rhetoric of Malema would mirror the actions of Mugabe and the ZANU-PF, especially since the EFF has been linked to several instances of arson and violence, and with Malema's regular repetition of Mugabe's slogans on Twitter. This has led to an under-siege sentiment among some, exacerbated by being combined with a volatile domestic crime landscape, which has included many killings of South African farmers in their homes. The suspicion which accompanied the end of apartheid, the difficult transition to democracy, and the lingering distrust have resulted in some rather peculiar resolutions. Some have advocated for the establishment of a separate homeland for the Afrikaner people, the predominant white population of South Africa. The so-called Volkstaat idea arose around the end of apartheid, deriving from historic self-determination plans by the Boers. Some fringe groups continue to actively support the idea, which is also sympathized with by the Freedom Front Plus, the largest party representing Afrikaner interests. In fact, the Volkstaat idea has extended as far as the establishment of planned communities. In the years since 1994, settlements such as Orania and Kleinfontein have been built, gated communities inhabited exclusively by ethnic Afrikaners. Orania, in particular, has gained fame and some notoriety for its seemingly exclusionary residency policy mandating that only ethnic Afrikaners may settle there, and that is only after a screening by the town council. Despite negative attention, its town council has argued that the settlement is above all a cultural project intended to preserve Afrikaner heritage, the Afrikaans language, and to provide a safe haven from South Africa's rising crime rate. But it doesn't help Orania's image that one of its features is a prominent statue of Hendrik Verwoerd, or that the area on which it was built was subject to one of the last evictions of the apartheid era, when 64 black African families were resettled in a town around 160 kilometers away, only a few months before the town was established in 1991. Given its image and many years of negative press, many have questioned why a town like Orania, with its strict and exclusionary residency criteria, is even allowed to exist. However, the right to Afrikaner self-determination was something enshrined in South Africa's constitution amidst the transfer of power in 1994. Moreover, the right to self-determination is guaranteed and exercised by multiple groups in South Africa, not least the Zulus, with their own king. And some even look at places like Orania, with agricultural self-sufficiency and its own power sources, as a sort of inspiration amid the woes of the nation elsewhere. High crime rates and the failing energy system have resulted in the town's population having dramatically risen from a handful of families in the 1990s to around 3,000 by 2024. Efforts to mitigate the crime surge are also occurring elsewhere. Private security firms have taken off in South Africa, especially in its major cities. According to NPR, there are more than 2.7 million registered private security officers in the country, making South Africa's security industry one of the largest in the world and far outnumbering its its estimated 150,000 police officers. Many of these firms patrol wealthy gated communities in the suburbs of cities like Cape Town and Johannesburg. Heavily armed personnel also patrol exposed or vulnerable farmland communities, many of which have installed rigid perimeter fences and security systems alongside the rise of volunteer neighborhood watch movements. Some groups of disaffected farmers and landowners have even formed what amount to self-defense militias. This includes the Suidlanders, an ethno-nationalist group which believes in an impending race war or pogrom and which pursues self-sufficiency and survival training to prepare accordingly. So, returning to the central question of South Africa's great wealth inequality, it's difficult to foresee a satisfactory resolution to the problem. You see, aside from the legality or morality of land expropriation without compensation, it is likely that this would lead not only to great instability, but perhaps also to the flight of landowning communities abroad. The wealthier South Africans are, like in most countries, the most well-educated, and the possibility of their emigration resulting in brain drain and the collapse of some of South Africa's industries may be swift in the event of the rapid redistribution of assets. Such was the case in nearby Zimbabwe, when Mugabe's controversial expropriations, while popular with many, caused the collapse of the economy and an astronomical level of inflation. This ultimately killed the country's currency and actually exacerbated its dire economic prospects even further. South Africa even had a taste of such development itself. In the years after apartheid, around 1/5 of the white population emigrated abroad. That led to skill shortages, which hampered South Africa's economy to the extent that it was forced to introduce curbs on capital export and cuts to pension payments, and its tax revenues declined. And South Africa really cannot afford to tank its own economy. The country has been beset by myriad problems in recent years, which some link to poor governance and corruption by the ruling ANC. This has included high crime, high unemployment, health problems, and political instability. But that's not all. South Africa's infrastructure is also teetering. The country has suffered electrical power shortages for years, being beset by rolling blackouts affecting much of the country, and which are locally referred to as load shedding. Gang violence has also risen dramatically, especially in the poor townships of major cities and the Cape Town hinterland, known as the Cape Flats. South Africa has now got one of the highest murder rates in the world and also suffers from an HIV/AIDS epidemic and high rates of drug abuse. All this in addition to its aforementioned high rates of poverty and inequality. To upset the fragile economy risks adding another major problem to the country, aside from the threat of political instability and fracturing of the fragile racial harmony in place. The state has an even more recent case in point to relate what sudden instability could look like. Allegations of corruption led to the 2021 arrest of Jacob Zuma, former president of the ANC and South Africa, but massive protests by supporters led to widespread looting and rioting that summer, amidst a general dissatisfaction with high crime, inequality and unemployment, all of which had been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. 354 people died in the course of a summer of unrest. With this in mind, it could be argued that the South African government does not have the time or means to take on the huge question of how to resolve inequality, especially given more short-term problems, as well as the responses that such a move could entail. And some analysts have claimed that the legacy of apartheid does not even fully explain that massive inequality, and that to target the predominantly white landowning population would provide all the instability for little benefit. You see, part of the reason why the country's problems and the poverty rate of black South Africans has grown so much is because of runaway demographic growth, with the South African population having sharply risen since 1994. At the end of apartheid, South Africa had around 43 million people, of whom the white population consisted around 10% at some 4.5 million. That population is now 60 million, and although the white population has remained more or less the same, it has proportionately fallen to around 7% of the population, with the black and coloured's population having grown exponentially in that time. This has led to even more overpopulation in poor districts and a rise in the number of people born to and living in great poverty, despite the legal and economic entitlements of the black community not having fallen in that time. Moreover, if the assets of the wealthy were redistributed, the question would follow: whom should they be given to? The Zimbabwean example showed just how fraught this question could be. Mugabe and the ZANU-PF seized the lands of around 4,000 white farmers, which were redistributed to around 1 million black Africans. However, this resulted in most people benefiting only fractionally and came with the complete disruption of Zimbabwe's agricultural industry. Given the corruption that both the ANC and the EFF, the most vocal advocates of land reappropriation, have been accused, it is highly unlikely that such redistribution would be carried out equitably, and seized assets would simply end up in the hands of party cronies rather than impoverished communities. With time running out for the ANC, it's clear that some solution needs to be found to at least some of South Africa's problems. If they fail, who knows what will follow?